Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. The last time America saw upheaval in the streets close to what we are seeing today, a time when the President of the United States deployed military force against citizens, a time of sit-ins and nationwide marches and the founding of many progressive social movements. Well, that was back in 1968. And guess what? There was a pandemic flu then too, one of three that happened in the 20th century. 1 to 4 million people are believed to have died in that Hong Kong flu pandemic. Eyes around the world are now on America and how it is managing this COVID crisis, its racism crisis, and its economic and unemployment crisis. And eyes are on China for what it did. Did China shut down a lab engaged in early genetic sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus after that lab published its work on an international website? Did the WHO struggle for more than a month with China for access to that information and not inform anyone that a high-stakes global health information struggle was underway? These are alleged in recent AP writing that our next guest has taken note of, one of the keenest observers of both global affairs and U.S. domestic political affairs that I know. Ian Bremmer is editor-at-large of Time magazine, an American political scientist specializing in U.S. foreign and international economic policy, states in transition, and global political risk. You name it, he does it. In fact, he's the creator of Wall Street's first global political risk index. He's authored 10 books and is president and founder of Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting firm. Ian, welcome, and thanks for joining us. You wrote this piece that's saying, hey, we're back in 1968 to some degree. And 1968 was an inflection point in many ways, for the United States at that time. But this seems bigger, and I don't know if you agree with my sense that this, Larry Summers has said this is a hinge moment in American history in how it's looked at in the world, what its parallel will be. So I'd love to get your dashboard of what you think equities are at stake today in these various crises that we're struggling with.
That's much bigger. It's bigger in terms of the economic impact. Until we have a vaccine that is proven to work and is distributed around the world, we're not going to have the global economy coming back to the way it was. And I think the impact of that, even though we're going to see a fairly robust short-term rebound here in the United States in terms of jobs, it doesn't get you back close to where you were. And I think it's adequate and appropriate to describe this as the first depression we've had since the Great Depression, much bigger an impact than 2008, 2009. On top of that, you have no international coordination or leadership. It's what I call a G0 world. It's a lack of geopolitical alignment. And that plays out both in terms of the growing confrontation directly between the world's two largest economies, the United States and China, but also in the vaccine nationalism as we search for a cure, the lack of coordination on medical supply chain, or on test kits, and of course also the lack of legitimacy of domestic political institutions all over the democratic world, here in the United States, in Brazil, across Europe. You're seeing so much social discord, some of which of course is becoming violent, yes, in the middle of a pandemic. So, I mean, if we could just respond to the pandemic, right? If it was just the whole world says, like in 2008, 2009, oh my God, we've got a financial crisis, we should all respond to that, make sure it doesn't become a depression, you would feel like that would be a serious problem, but you could get your arms around it. The problem is that we have the largest crisis, largest shock to the global economy of your and my lifetimes, Steve. And the response is not only wholly inadequate and uncoordinated, but indeed it's touching off a number of additional confrontations.
Well, what is raging nationalism? And we've already seen, even before COVID hit, a kind of growth of pugnacious nationalism in many countries around the world. You and I have talked about liberal regimes versus illiberal regimes that seem to be successful economically. Do you worry that America is tipping towards being more like China than less like China?
Certainly, China is not becoming more like the United States. For the last 30 years, the big thing that the American foreign policy establishment got wrong, I mean, almost to a man, and I use the gendered term of that advisedly, is that China, as it gets wealthier, would look more like the United States. They'd become responsible stakeholders. They'd want to join our institutions, would align more with our values. They would jettison state capitalism and they'd become more of a free market economy. They would even politically liberalize. None of that has happened. And indeed, you could certainly make the argument that if you look at the trends in technology, where it's less about the communications revolution, the worldwide internet, instead about surveillance and the increasing influence that a small number of super empowered corporations aligned increasingly with the US government have, that will allow us to get back on our feet and be a much more dominant power again as we get out of the coronavirus crisis. Yeah, you could imply, I mean, that the US is going to have more industrial policy. The state is going to be much more interventionist in the economy. I don't think that the US political system is becoming authoritarian. I really don't. Despite the authoritarian tendencies of President Trump, I don't think the institutions are changing all that much. But on the economic side and the role of the government, you could argue that the Americans are becoming more like China than the Chinese are becoming like the United States. Yes.
Now, Donald Trump has bashed China, but along with bashing China, he has bashed the World Health Organization. And we heard him say we're withdrawing from the World Health Organization, although there seem to be some efforts to get us back into some parts of that. But you also, in your latest note that you sent publicly, said the WHO wasn't transparent, that there was this deep fight going over the genetic coding of COVID-19 in a Chinese research lab, and that there was lack of transparency on all sides of this. So how much is Donald Trump on the right side of the equation when it comes to the critique of both China and the WHO?
He is absolutely on the right side of the equation in his critique of China. He's absolutely on the wrong side of the equation in his critique of the WHO. Now, fortunately, Trump can't actually leave. It requires a year. It's like the Paris Climate Accord. So he makes this huge announcement, and in reality, it doesn't move the needle very much. The U.S. would also have to pay its arrears to the WHO before it could leave. It's kind of like the UK leaving the EU. So the devil's in the details on this stuff. If Biden actually wins, WHO relationship continues as it has been. But the WHO is a weak organization, and it is weak by structural design. It does not criticize its donor states. So when the Chinese are not being transparent with the WHO tries to get data from China, but when they fail, they don't criticize China. By the way, when the WHO knows that the United States doesn't have test kits that work, they don't criticize the United States. Would have saved a lot of lives if they had, but they can't. U.S. is a major donor. WHO can say stuff privately. They cannot say it publicly. The leadership is constrained. It's meant to be weak. Now, the fact that it's weak by design and all of the donor states have been complicit in that, I'd love a stronger WHO. We ain't getting one. But as Donald Rumsfeld might have said, you fight a pandemic with the WHO you have, not the WHO you want. And the idea that you would try to weaken the WHO in the middle of a freaking pandemic is insane on its face. So no, Trump is really wrong about that. But in terms of China, it is very clear in this AP study that just came out, investigation, it adds to that. It's very clear that the lab that initially made known the human-to-human transmission and actually put the genome posted information on an individual rogue scientist, posted it on an international website, and the next day that lab was shut down by the Chinese government. That is absolutely appalling behavior. It is behavior that shows a complete cover-up on the part of the Chinese government, not to allow their own people to know about this virus, and of course not to allow anyone else in the world to know about this virus for weeks while the Chinese were traveling across China from Wuhan and to the United States, almost 500,000 over that month, going from Wuhan to the US. That's how we got the early cases. That's how we got the pandemic today. So, I mean, look, Peter Navarro, massive bomb thrower, clearly an advocate of a new Cold War with the Chinese. But when he says that China is originally responsible for this pandemic, not just because it came from there, but because they actively covered it up as a government, yes, that's true. And if Trump didn't make that known in an election time, he'd get destroyed by Biden on that issue. So this is getting overly politicized now, Steve. It is a problem. And it's good. It potentially could get worse than it needs to get. But both on that, as well as the Chinese taking away autonomy from Hong Kong, no more one state, two systems that they had agreed to legally. Any U.S. president, any U.S. administration, left or right, would strongly be responding against that behavior on the part of the world's second largest economy.
So along, some of the things you've written so eloquently about the G0 world, of which I've been a fan, we're supposed to be having a G7 meeting coming up, and Angela Merkel on a phone call with Donald Trump says, I'm sick of spending time with you and I'm not going to show up. So President Trump recommends maybe South Korea, Brazil, India, Russia, and you're not a believer that a G11 is just going to pop up. But I guess my deeper question about these G7 arrangements is, do they matter anymore in a G0 world?
They matter less than they used to, and again, it's not anybody's fault. It's because the institutions are very sticky. They resist being changed at a time when the geopolitical order has changed dramatically. So, Steve, I mean, if you and I were in a room and we were asked to create the most robust alliance we could for the United States internationally that reflects the challenges of 2020 and what we expect going forward, we would not create anything that looks remotely like NATO. And I'm not even talking about how much the United States puts in as opposed to our allies economically or militarily. I'm saying NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty, right? It is focused on Russia. Turkey's a member, the East Europeans. It's focused on conventional and nuclear weapons. That is not remotely the principal challenge the Americans are facing right now. It is China. It is largely not about nuclear weapons. It's only regionally about conventional weapons. It's mostly about technology and cyber and IP and medical equipment and the vaccine. I mean, the organization that you and I would come up with, Steve, would literally look nothing like NATO. The Japanese would be in it, the South Koreans, the Australians, probably the Germans, the Canadians, the UK, probably not the East Europeans or the Italians, certainly not Turkey. And the mission statement and the focus and the money that would be spent would be completely different. And so in that environment, whether you're talking about the G7 or whether you're talking about the World Trade Organization or the Security Council, I mean, all of these organizations were created at a different geopolitical time by countries with values that they thought were going to become universalist and that have not. And you also have an American population that's much less interested in being the global sheriff, in promoting global trade, or even in promoting democracy internationally. They're not even sure it works at home in the United States. So given all of that, there's really no surprise that when we look at the G7 or Trump's suggestion that actually we should have a G11 and invite 4 new states, including Russia, to be a part of it, there's no surprise that something is fundamentally broken here.
Just in our last couple of minutes, Ian, years ago, you got me involved in something called the World Economic Forum Global Council on Geopolitical Risk. And we used to sit around in nice places and brainstorm about all the bad stuff that could undo society as we knew it. And we got some of it very accurate. And now we've got lots of risks playing out in real time. I'm interested in the blind spot risks today. What are the few big things that you still see out there that remain substantial risks to the United States and really the liberal, order as we know it in the world?
I think the weakness and vulnerability of a lot of the middle-income emerging markets that are highly indebted. They're right now having an easy time getting access to credit, low interest rates, the money's still there. 6 months, 12 months out, as the real economy faces the depth of this challenge, and they don't have in those countries the money to bail themselves out, and it's harder for them to have access to credit markets. I think we could be facing a round of major emerging market collapses, something that would bring us back to the 80s in terms of the scale. And European banks are much more vulnerable than American banks. This could metastasize. So that's one that I don't see anyone talking about right now.
Hmm.
I'd worry about it. I also think, depending on where energy prices, commodity prices are right then, some of those producers could be the most vulnerable. Not the Saudis with deep pockets or the Qataris with deep pockets. Rather, I'd be talking about a country like Iraq,
Mhm.
right? Or Lebanon that, relies on the largesse of those countries, for example, and Ecuador. Countries like that could be in an awful lot of trouble in the next 6, 12 months.
Well, I want to thank you, Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group and editor-at-large of Time Magazine, but my resident big thinker. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Steve Clemons. You have a great weekend and be well.